Hello, welcome to the third lesson on Soviet history. In this lesson, I'm going to try and get through Stalin's period of politics. So that's from 1921 to 1953. We're going to be trying to tackle quite a large stretch of time here, so if it ends up being too long, I might split the video up into two, because I understand that 40-minute videos aren't really that appealing to anybody. To start off, I've got some bad news, and that's that Lenin's dead. From 1921 to his death, he suffered a series of strokes. His last few left him unable to talk. And what this did was it created this debate within the Bolshevik Party, which, by the way, is now renamed the Communist Party of Russia. So starting off in 1921, the concept of a true Leninist begins to emerge, and that's the idea that if we can't have Lenin, we need someone as good as Lenin. It's almost as if they're trying to find somebody that's so like Lenin, it doesn't really matter that he's died. And the reason that Lenin has such a huge role in society at this point, such a huge role that they need to find someone exactly like him, is all because when he was alive, there was this huge cult of personality created. He was shown to be the leader of the revolution, and so he had this huge role that needed to be filled. And out of this idea of being a true Leninist, we can see how the leadership struggle is going to take place. First off, prior to looking at what actually happened in the leadership struggle, I'd like to first look at which advantages Stalin had going forward, because spoiler alert, he wins the leadership struggle. So first off, the party, quite like any political party, was full of bureaucracy. And what this means is that there were certain offices, certain positions that were really important. And Stalin had arguably the most important position, or at least the most powerful position in the party, and that was the role of General Secretary. And what General Secretary means is that it allowed him to choose who got promoted in the party, who gets let into the party, and so it allows him to choose his friends to come and support him. He's also, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this properly, but he was the Rabkrin, and what this means is that he was in charge of also discipline in the party. So he was in charge of disciplinary forces which would punish people from going against the party line. And also there was a policy called Lenin Enrollment, which I'd like to talk about. Lenin Enrollment was, well, quite frankly, it was enrollment to the party. So in 1924, 128,000 mostly workers joined the party because Stalin let them in. So it's worth thinking that Stalin has let in a very large number of people who, one, are probably too uneducated to question his point of view, but two, are also quite loyal to him because they've now got a really good party job rather than just working in a factory or whatever. So we've looked at Stalin. Now let's look at Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev and Bukharin. These four men are what we'd call Stalin's peers, at least in the party, but later on, for the most part, they're his rivals. First off, let's go for Trotsky. So Trotsky was, I think in many ways, quite the opposite to Stalin. He was known as being very silver-tongued, so he was a great orator. But also he was kind of like the cool kid, I suppose, of the party, which many party politicians didn't like because they thought he was stealing the limelight. It's also worth considering with Trotsky that he was a Bolshevik prior to about 1913. So his loyalty to Lenin was questioned. Also, quite interestingly, he was Jewish, and in Russia, like there is now to some extent, there's quite a lot of anti-Semitism. So all these things went against him. If you're interested in learning more about Trotsky, this is a book which could be quite useful. And this has lots of his speeches in it. He was a really good orator. And I think we can see that Stalin wouldn't have been able to beat Trotsky had it not been his manipulation of the party bureaucracy. But we'll go on to that later. Zinoviev, Kamenev and Bukharin were all good party members. So they were members either of the party congress, or they were members of the Politburo. Zinoviev was largely considered to be the front runner, at least at the start of the leadership struggle, and that was in some part because he was such a close friend of Lenin. In fact, he claimed that his handwriting had gotten so similar to Lenin's just because they were so similar as people. So already we can see how this idea of being a true Leninist has come into play. We can split the leadership struggle up into 3 stages. So the first of which happened in 1923. Zinoviev, Kamenev and Stalin went up against Trotsky. And I think this shows how clever Stalin was, because he decided that Trotsky was the biggest threat, which he was, and decided to lump up support from his peers. He took quite a backseat role. In fact, he continues to take a backseat role even into his next alliance. But he takes a backseat role. He lets Zinoviev and Kamenev make fun of Trotsky, essentially. So the idea of being a Trotskyite is something seen as opposite to Leninism. You can't be a Trotskyite and you can't be a Leninist. They're two differing ideals. One of the big things that they disagreed on was socialism in one country, which I'll go on to a bit later on. Now, as you can see, Stalin ditches Zinoviev and Kamenev and teams up with Bukharin in a triumvirate. The issues here are quite economic. So Stalin claims, alongside Bukharin, that the NEP is working quite well, and that Zinoviev and Kamenev aren't true Leninists. But as we can see, by 1928, Stalin's had enough of Bukharin. We can see that Zinoviev and Kamenev and Trotsky are all out of the picture at this point, and so it's Stalin versus Bukharin. Stalin then amasses so much support by backing a left-wing economic system, and for those who aren't economists, that kind of means that he really goes against free enterprise. After 1928, Stalin is indisputably the leader of the Communist Party and, as a result of that, the leader of the Soviet Union. Not much happens, at least on the political front, from 1928 to 1934. But in 1934, Kirov is murdered. Now, I know I've just jumped to his murder, but Kirov was quite an important member in the party. So in Russia, you have 2 key cities that, like, I'm not trying to be controversial, but those are the cities that really matter. So you've got Moscow and St. Petersburg, or Petrograd, or Leningrad. It changes a lot, but at this time it's called Leningrad. So Stalin has his power base in Moscow, but there's also a Leningrad part of the party, and that was led by Kirov. Kirov ended up in various congresses getting more votes than Stalin, but Stalin stayed leader. Quite a few senior party members were saying to Kirov, you should go and challenge Stalin, but Kirov didn't seem interested. They also differed on the prosecution of a guy called Ryutin, who was accused of being anti-Leninist. Kirov also argued for more consumer goods in their economic policies, but I'll stick away from economics too much because that's going to be covered in a different video. So Kirov is murdered in 1934, and in December 1934, and this begins a series of purges. If you learn about Stalin, you almost certainly learn about the purges. Those are what he's most famous for. The purges are largely of political males, so not so many females, but mostly men who were living in the apartment blocks reserved for civil servants. Stalin uses Kirov's murder as an excuse to say that there is in fact a plot against not only his leadership, but the leadership of the Communist Party. And so he uses that as an excuse to start murdering people. The Great Purge is in 1936 to 37ish, but overall in the Purges you have about 10 million people who were killed. There is an entire section on this course based on terror and control of the people, and so we'll cover that in a bit more detail there. On the political front though, you have show trials at this point. There are 3 trials that you need to know about. So there's the trial of the 16, the trial of the 17, and the trial of the 21. The first 2 are easy to remember because if it's the trial of the 16, that happened in 36, trial of the 17 happened in 37, and this one kind of just diverges from that really nice pattern. But for the first trial was of Zinoviev and Kamenev. The second trial was of supporters of Trotsky. Bear in mind at this point Trotsky is no longer in Russia, he has gone to Mexico. And then the trial of the 21 was of Bukharin. But it wasn't just the political elite that were purged, it was also many members of the army. If you've ever seen those Hitler rant videos where people subtitle it moaning about their GCSE maths exam, there's a point in the video where Hitler mentions Stalin, and what he's actually saying is, I should have purged my army like Stalin. I'm not sure if that would have worked out much for Hitler, but you know, I just think that's an interesting fact. Moving away now from the purges in 1941, you have an event which is probably, at the risk of sounding controversial, one of the most important events in the Soviet Union's entire 70-odd year history, and that's the Second World War. So they don't join the war at the same time we did, they joined it in 1941, and that was when Hitler broke his non-aggression pact. But the chances are you probably know all about that. We're here to look at the domestic impacts of the Second World War. Stalin makes himself head of the Council of Ministers, and I'm sorry again to use the term Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers is another word for the Sovnarkom. When we looked at the political landscape of things in the first video, Sovnarkom is the head of the state. Well, at this point it's called the Council of Ministers, and Stalin makes himself the chair of the Council of Ministers. He also creates the GKO. The GKO is a war cabinet of sorts. It was to be in charge of arms manufacture and also economic planning. And then you also have, so as Stalin makes himself the head of the Council of Ministers, he also begins to integrate state employees in the party apparatus. And what I mean by that is that he would take some people who were powerful in the state apparatus and move them into powerful positions within the Politburo or the rest of the party. The effect of this is that you have much more cooperation between the two branches of government. It's important to consider that prior to this the party have just been running things and the state have just been to rubber stamp things. So it's much more of a cooperation. But Stalin isn't doing this because he's nice. He's doing this first and foremost because he wants to spread out his power base, which I'll move on to in a minute or two. Just before that though, I'd like to address the Leningrad Affair of 1949. It's actually quite a cool name for an event, the Leningrad Affair. It sounds a bit like a James Bond film. But the Leningrad Affair was the arrest of 2,000 people in the Leningrad Party in 1949. What essentially, at least by the account of the textbook that we're using, Stalin saw that there was a rising power within the Leningrad Party. He thought that they were being too independent, and so he thought to shut them down. However, there is some sort of kind of controversy surrounding Beria, who was the head of the secret police, who carried out the purges. He might have had some enemies or rivals within the Leningrad branch of the party, so he nudged Stalin into doing it. Finally, in this time period, we have what I like to call musical chairs, and I don't write this in your exam, but I think it's quite an easy way of looking at And by musical chairs, I mean that whenever things got uncomfortable for Stalin, he just got up and went to another chair. So what I mean by this is he kept changing the seat of power within Russia and the Soviet Union. And he did this by moving himself physically from one branch of the party and state apparatus to the other. Originally it's the Politburo, then in 1938 he moves it to the GKO, and then after the war it goes to the Council of Ministers. What's the effect of this? Well, Stalin's quite clever in this sense, because he realises that if he keeps moving himself physically, people cannot come and argue with him and they can't try and rival him. He kind of just moves before the pressure in any one branch of government becomes such that he might be kicked out. Also, this spreads his influence across the entire political landscape of the Soviet Union. He wasn't the type of leader to be ousted if the Communist Party were ousted. In fact, even if he hadn't done all of this terror, there's a good chance he would have stayed in power just because he had such a strong grasp of how party bureaucracy works. So what's changed then from Lenin to Stalin? And this is a question which may well come up on your exam. I hope it doesn't though. And the reason why is that I think the political change questions are normally quite harsh unless they're for a longer time period, but anyway, doesn't matter. Stalin is at this point totally unchallenged. There was no way anyone was ever going to try and challenge his power. If they withstood the cult of personality created around him, which is something we'll go on to later on in the course, they would have been way too scared of being killed. Stalin had this huge ability to just scare people through the mass terror that he created, and I suppose for good reason. Stalinists were also all put in positions of power. It's worth considering that if you're killing millions upon millions of people, it's quite easy then to just get people who like you to take the place of those dead people. So Stalin and Stalin's loyalty spread right across Soviet politics. The NKVD becomes a huge player in the Soviet Union. As I've said before, this course is one where there's loads and loads of weird changing names. The NKVD, I have no idea what it stands for, and luckily for us we don't need to know, because it's like some weird Russian stretch of words. But the NKVD is the secret police. Before it was called the Cheka, and in between it's called a variety of things. I might make a video just going over the names because it's quite tricky. The leader of the NKVD is a powerful person. By 1953 it's Beria, but it goes across a few different people. So it starts off with Yagoda, then on to Yezhov, then on to Beria. But again, we'll go through that at a later time. Socialism in one country. So this was something which was challenged over here. But it's something which continues to I would say influence Soviet politics right to the end of the Soviet Union. Lenin and particularly Trotsky had this idea that if they could encourage a revolution in their country, which they did, it would then cause the rest of Europe and eventually the world to have a revolution. And so the Soviet Union then had a role in supporting other revolutions. Stalin, on the other hand, didn't think that was that important. He thought that they should be much more inward-looking. If the capitalist bourgeois empire were to collapse, great. But if it doesn't, then that's cool for us too. That was his kind of point of view. The death of pluralism. I spoke about this kind of briefly in the Lenin video, but by this point there is no pluralism within the party anymore. It's either Stalin's way or you die. It's not even that you just don't. It's not even that you're just unable to progress in the party if you don't agree with him. You're not allowed to progress in life. He would get rid of you. And finally, there is the change in the power structure. And this, I think, is one of the most profound ways in which Stalin changes Soviet politics, at least right to the end. He makes it so that this isn't just a country run by the 13 or however many people in the Politburo. It is a party. It is a state even, which is run by a government. So it's what I call a state apparatus, by a political apparatus, and also by an apparatus of bringing about terror. And so it's these three kind of pillars, I would say, of Soviet politics, which we'll see interact later on. Stalin himself, I suppose I could add briefly, and I think also at this point in the video you could probably turn it off if you're not that interested in learning more about Stalin. But Stalin is seen as quite a divisive figure. As the leader, he did some things which could be considered to be successful. He is overwhelmingly considered to be a horrible person, I think for good reason. He has a really great life story, and for that I would say this. It's good. He is one of those figures which I think could not have come to fame or could not have got anything done with his life had it not been in Russia. Russia after the revolution is one of the most unique times in history, in the sense that it was not the handsome American politicians who had the power. It was the short, pockmarked face of Joseph Stalin which led everything. Also, if you're interested in Stalinist Russia, 1984 by George Orwell is a good one. And also, as we progress through the course, when we look at literature produced in the Soviet Union, a lot of it is denouncing Stalin's Russia. He is a figure which is really interesting to read about, and there is plenty of opportunity to do so. I hope that this has been useful. It has been quite depressing though to talk about the deaths of 10 million people. However, I think it's worth learning about, and it's going to be really useful for our course. I hope to see you again next time.